On a July morning, while most Americans were still gearing up for summer vacation, a decision out of Washington set off a domino effect far beyond what anyone had anticipated. The Trump administration unexpectedly announced a 35% tariff on softwood lumber imports from Canada, a material that might seem simple, but actually makes up a third of the total housing construction supply in the United States. Within just a few hours of the announcement, the American building materials market was thrown into turmoil. Major construction firms sounded the alarm, lumber prices skyrocketed, contracts were delayed, and the futures market suffered some of its sharpest drops since the pandemic. But the shockwaves didn't just hit Canada. It turned out to be a self-inflicted blow to the US economy itself. Because unlike distant rivals, Canada is a longtime neighbor closely intertwined with the US. Lumber from British Columbia, Quebec, and Ontario has long formed the backbone of millions of American homes, from the snow-covered Northeast to the sunny suburbs of Florida. But this time, Ottawa didn't remain silent like it had before. Canada was no longer willing to quietly endure being taken for granted. They didn't just voice their opposition, they prepared to act. The Canadian government quickly began reviewing measures to restrict lumber exports, something that hadn't been seriously considered in years. It was the first warning shot. Each plank of wood was no longer just a construction material. It had become a strategic asset, a bargaining chip for targeted retaliation. That shift marked a turning point. Canada wasn't just reacting to protect itself, it was subtly steering the narrative onto a new playing field, where value isn't measured solely in tariffs or trade figures, but in soft power, supply chains, and consumer psychology. The US's 35% tariff, rather than applying pressure, turned out to be the spark that ignited a chain of unintended consequences. And while the US continued to struggle with the puzzle of boosting domestic supply, hindered by environmental regulations on logging, Canada quietly tightened the flow of lumber heading south. Not with loud declarations, but with practical steps, prioritizing supply for domestic housing projects, especially those using sustainable materials and green building techniques. Provincial governments in places like British Columbia and Ontario introduced new targets. Canadian lumber should first serve Canadians. What seemed like a simple, obvious move became, in the current context, a carefully calculated counterstrike. Because in a trade war, the weapons are no longer tanks or missiles, but supply chains. And Canada knows it holds a critical link in America's construction ecosystem. They didn't cut it off, they just began to tighten it, gradually turning the faucet, bit by bit, so the other side could feel what dependency really means, something they'd long taken for granted. And that's when every piece of lumber, once just a raw, unassuming product, suddenly became a powerful instrument of retaliation. Canada understands this well. In a trade war, the weapons aren't roaring bombs, but the quiet flows of supply chains. And within that chain, softwood from their northern forests is nothing less than a lifeline for America's construction industry. There was no need for loud protests or rash decisions to cut off supply altogether. Instead, they chose a calm yet razor-sharp approach, tightening the faucet, not shutting it off, just slowly squeezing it, bit by bit. In provinces like Ontario, Quebec, and especially British Columbia, local governments quickly rolled out new policies. A large portion of lumber would now be reserved for domestic needs. Social housing projects, green buildings using engineered wood, and neighborhoods built with prefab timber walls all were given top priority. This meant that US orders, which once flowed automatically, now had to wait in line. Some lumber shipments slowed down. Some containers were postponed indefinitely, and in the silence of delayed delivery calendars, the shift in balance became unmistakably clear. Across the border, the response came swiftly. American builders raised the alarm. The National Association of Home Builders, NAHB, released a series of troubling statistics. Lumber prices had jumped over 30% in just a few weeks. The cost of building a new home surged by at least $10,000, a significant blow in a market where mortgage rates were still hovering around 7%. In a housing market already difficult to access, the door to homeownership was now closing even further for millions of young families. And when that door closes, it's not just the housing market that suffers. It's the belief in the American dream that begins to fracture. Because when people can't buy homes, they don't spend on furniture, on cars, on education, and the engine of the US consumer economy starts to sputter. The real estate bond market feels the impact. Building materials stocks tumble, and major cities, where housing demand is constantly stretched to the limit, are forced to delay countless projects due to soaring costs. And it all started with something seemingly small: wood. A material once thought of as replaceable, a commodity you can get anywhere. But the reality is, not everywhere can deliver with the speed, stability, quality, and cost-effectiveness of Canada. And that's exactly why every plank of wood now serves not just as a material, but as a strategic reminder. Never take for granted the links you once assumed were unshakable. Canada didn't retaliate with anger, but with precision. They didn't strike emotions, they struck systems. No slogans, just a quiet chain reaction that forced the other side to reflect on how their decisions are made. And when lumber began disappearing from warehouses in Texas, when building projects had to be redesigned due to material shortages, Washington started to feel more tangibly the cost of what once seemed like a simple decision. But here's the thing: Canada didn't stop at retaliation. They saw in this crisis an opportunity, not to get even, but to evolve. Because as the door to the US slowly closes, other doors, wider, more sustainable, are beginning to open across the globe. And that's when Canada made a pivotal move. Not just selling lumber to America, but to the world. Canada didn't just react, they seized the moment. When the flow of lumber to the US was blocked by tariff barriers, Ottawa saw an opportunity to do what arguably should have been done long ago: reimagine the lumber industry. Instead of remaining a cheap raw materials depot for American factories, Canada began to ask itself, why export unprocessed timber when it could export intelligence, added value, and a vision for sustainable growth? The answer came swiftly. Within months, a wave of initiatives was set in motion. From boosting investment in prefab wall manufacturing plants, to expanding high-tech wood processing centers, to supporting export-driven furniture companies. Refined wood products, which once made up only a small portion of the industry, were now elevated as strategic spearheads. The federal government rolled out green finance packages, encouraging the wood industry to shift toward cleaner, smarter, and globally competitive operations. This wasn't a temporary adjustment to counter American tariffs. It was a deliberate transformation. Because when Canada looked outward, it saw itself in a uniquely favorable position. It produces FSC-certified wood, highly valued in European, Japanese, and Australian markets. It benefits from major free trade agreements like CPTPP and CETA, which reduce or eliminate tariffs in developed economies, and most importantly, it enjoys strong environmental credibility, a quality that's becoming increasingly vital to global consumers. Now, instead of being funneled into American housing sites, each plank of wood is transformed into precision-engineered panels shipped to Tokyo, where wooden skyscrapers are the latest architectural trend. A maple desk no longer sits in a New York office, but in the minimalist workspace of a tech firm in Copenhagen. A prefabricated timber column, once destined for suburban Texas, is now being installed in a green school in Melbourne, Australia. These humble pieces of wood have broken free from merely laying the foundation for someone else's dream and become the starting blocks of a new, bolder vision. The dream of a Canadian lumber industry that's independent, distinctive, and capable of leading global construction trends. In the past, many Canadian industries lived in America's shadow. Too close, too dependent, too comfortable. But this time was different. The tariff shock became a wake-up call. And instead of retreating into the familiar, Canada stepped forward, building a path of its own. At every international expo, Canada's lumber booths now carry more than just product catalogs. They carry a narrative of sustainability, of green buildings, of the future of construction in a low-carbon era. In every promotional video, Canada is no longer just the northern forest, but a symbol of resilience, innovation, and strategic thinking in a turbulent world. And as Canada stepped out, more confident, more calculated, the US, once assumed to be in control, began to feel itself slipping. Because while American developers were bogged down by costly materials, complex regulations, and domestic environmental barriers, Canadian factories were running at full capacity, orders were surging, and the world's attention was shifting toward one pressing question: How did a nation hit by tariffs manage to turn the tables so brilliantly? At that moment, a strange irony came into full view. Every setback in US construction became a quiet win for Canada. Not because Canada wished for America's failure, but because America created the void. And Canada simply stepped in, with purpose and poise. While America tirelessly searched for ways to replace Canadian lumber, a looming question began to surface within the construction industry. Is there a plan B that's truly practical and feasible? The answer, though rarely spoken aloud, was found in the silence of stalled construction sites, in the delays faced by real estate developers, and in the stunned expressions of American families staring at skyrocketing material prices. They were beginning to realize that replacing Canadian lumber wasn't as simple as making a few calls to Latin America or Europe. Lumber isn't a plug-and-play commodity you can just shift with containers and contracts. Europe, it might have lumber, but high transportation costs, long delivery times, and inconsistent supply capacity make it unreliable. Latin America, limited availability, inconsistent quality, and a logistics network not yet robust enough to meet strict building standards. Even increasing domestic production in the US posed major challenges, from strict forest protection regulations to a shortage of skilled labor to a convoluted permitting system. All of this made the dream of self-sufficiency seem increasingly out of reach. Meanwhile, north of the border, Canada didn't need to make a lot of noise. They simply kept doing what they had always done well, producing steadily, maintaining high quality, ensuring a clean and transparent supply chain, and quietly expanding into alternative markets. Each new export deal with Europe, each high-end furniture contract signed with Japan, each green building project in Australia helped solidify Canada's role in the global supply chain. And with every quiet step forward, the US found itself a step behind. This wasn't just a trade victory, it was a triumph of vision. While America scrambled with reactive decisions, Canada moved with long-term strategy. Where America tried to tax to control, Canada chose to export value to expand. The stumble in the US construction industry, from rising home prices to delayed projects to shaken consumer confidence, was the consequence of a short-sighted approach, and the void America created became the space Canada used to rise. Even the financial markets began to sense the imbalance. US construction stocks declined, real estate indices wavered, and investors began to question the reliability of the supply chain. Meanwhile, in Toronto and Vancouver, confidence grew. Lumber companies reported record profits, international orders surged, and some Canadian wood processing firms began listing on larger stock exchanges, a sign they were stepping onto the global stage. And as the balance continued to tip, what stood out most was this. No one saw Canada throwing press conferences or waving victory banners, because this wasn't a war they started, nor a win achieved by crushing a rival. It was a victory of composure, of adaptability, of thoughtful action, a win without fireworks, but one that left a deep impression on policymakers and economists alike. But the story doesn't end with trade, because when a country is wounded by a tariff, the response doesn't just come from its government, it reaches its people. And in Canada, a quiet movement had begun, not through resolutions, but through spending habits. No protests, no loud boycotts, just a quiet form of resistance, a growing reluctance to spend on American goods, and a question whispered in households across the country: are we still fueling an economy that no longer values us the way it once did? Not everyone sees the first cracks of a crisis forming in a supermarket aisle. But in Canada, it was the empty shelves where American products once stood. The absence of cars crossing the border to fuel up or shop at outlet malls in Buffalo or Seattle that signaled something deeper was spreading quietly, right in the hearts of consumers. It wasn't loud, it wasn't marked by protests or slogans, but it was deep and persistent. Canadians were pushing back with their wallets. It began naturally enough. A few people canceled their weekend shopping trips to New York, unwilling to support an economy that's taxing our country. Some retail stores in Ontario announced a preference for local or European goods. Consumer surveys soon picked up on the shift. American product sales in Canada were dropping noticeably. This wasn't just emotional anymore. It had become a defined trend born from a quiet, festering wound. The tariff on lumber, something few had paid much attention to, had unexpectedly struck at the core of national pride. To many Canadians, this wasn't just a trade dispute. It felt like an insult. A longtime ally, a trusted partner, sharing the world's longest peaceful border, being punished like an adversary. And when respect cracks and trust is damaged, the most natural response is withdrawal, stepping away from once familiar American brands, reconsidering those cross-border vacations that used to be yearly rituals, pulling back from consumer dependence and turning instead to new choices, local products or goods from Europe, Japan, or South Korea. In cities like Montreal, Vancouver, and Calgary, this shift plays out daily. A couple chooses a German car over an American one. A family replaces US-made breakfast cereal with a product from Manitoba. A coffee shop chain reduces its reliance on US-SI conglomerates to support Canadian suppliers instead. Each small decision adds up to a broader current, one where brand loyalty is no longer won through familiarity alone, but must now contend with political awareness and cultural pride. American businesses near the border are beginning to feel the sting. Reports from cities like Buffalo, Detroit, and Bellingham show a sharp drop in Canadian visitors. Some stores are reporting revenue losses of up to 30%. Shopping centers that once relied heavily on Canadian tourists are being forced to lay off staff, revise their promotions, and even lobby local politicians to pressure Washington into easing tensions. But once trust is broken, it's not something that can be patched up with a simple apology. In this picture, Canadians don't need calls for boycotts. They don't need media campaigns to stir them. They only need to remember that if today it's lumber, tomorrow it could be beef, electronics, produce, anything they consume daily. And if a major economy like the US can turn its back over a short-term calculation, then Canadians have every right to protect themselves through what they choose to buy, use, and believe in. This response, in many ways, is a quiet kind of vote for the future. Because consumption isn't just an economic act, it's a statement of values. And when millions of people collectively declare we want to be respected, no matter how much Washington might want to dismiss it, it becomes impossible to ignore. Through changing shopping carts, Canada is sending a message loud and clear. Respect cannot be taxed, and true partnerships can't be measured only by trade balances. We often assume that history's greatest confrontations are sparked by grand events, a war, a collapsed treaty, or a declaration from a head of state. But sometimes it only takes a single plank of wood, a material so seemingly ordinary, to set off a ripple effect that shakes everything from trade to finance, from bilateral relations to the very foundation of strategic trust. The lumber dispute between the US and Canada is no longer just a technical trade disagreement. It has become a mirror, clearly reflecting how a short-sighted decision can spiral into unintended consequences. When the Trump administration imposed a 35% tariff on softwood lumber from Canada, it wasn't just targeting a product, it unintentionally disrupted the entire construction supply chain within the US. It didn't just raise material costs, it left an entire industry scrambling for alternatives that simply weren't there. And most significantly, it strained one of the closest trade relationships America has ever had. Meanwhile, Canada, a smaller, quieter nation, responded with admirable composure. They didn't shout, they didn't retaliate with bluster, they simply pivoted. They turned lumber from raw commodity into high-value product. They expanded their markets, restructured their supply chains, and, perhaps most remarkably, inspired their own citizens to see consumption itself as a form of political expression. From a passive resource exporter, Canada transformed into a symbol of self-reliance, resilience, and sustainable strategy in an unpredictable age. And when those planks stopped flowing to construction sites in Texas and California and instead began appearing in wooden skyscrapers in Japan, green schools in Australia, and conference centers across Europe, then the world understood. Canada was not retreating. They were advancing on a path of their own. On a deeper level, this is a profound lesson in modern geopolitics, that power doesn't just come from military strength or GDP, but from control over supply chains, from steadiness in the face of pressure, and from recognizing that every trade decision made today could plant the seeds of a strategic shift tomorrow. America tried to use tariffs to pull production back home, but in doing so, it disrupted its own supply lines. Canada didn't need to retaliate. They simply elevated their value, and in doing so, rose to a higher position. And so the question becomes, if one plank of wood triggered this kind of shockwave, how many other planks are out there waiting to be set in motion? How many industries, how many relationships are teetering on the edge of fragility? And in a globalized world where every nation is a link in the chain, do we have the wisdom to act as partners rather than as rivals? We've just walked through a story that seemed small, but opens the door to enormous reflections. If this video gave you a new perspective, don't forget to leave a comment below. What do you think about the US-Canada lumber dispute? And can a single plank really teach us this much? Hit that subscribe button so you won't miss the next deep dive into geopolitics, where even the smallest details of the world are explored through a sharp and inspired lens. Thank you for listening and for being part of this journey.